Today, we're going to start looking at equity in early intervention and thinking about looking inward. I will mention this again at the end of the webinar, but in November, we're going to be thinking about looking outward and the systemic approach of that. So I am delighted to welcome my friend and colleague, Megan Schumacher Murphy, from up there where Hocus Pocus is famous. So she's from Salem, Massachusetts, and I will let her introduce herself and get us started. So Megan, thanks for joining us.
I'm so happy to be here. And yes, it is. Everything here is very crazy. I live right behind, for those of you Hocus Pocus fans, I live right behind what is known here as the Ropes Mansion, but is actually in Hocus Pocus Allison's house. So my neighborhood is all kinds of crazy right now, and they decorate it just like the movie. So things are really getting going for October in Salem, Massachusetts, and it's just as bananas as you would think it would be. I am so excited to be here today presenting on equity. And I bet you're wondering, I see your picture and I see your square up in the little corner. What is this like blue-eyed white woman doing talking to me about equity? Well, I'm going to tell you. The answer is we all of us are collectively responsible for addressing equity and racism in the society. And we can't expect that our Black and Latino, Latina, Latine, and Asian and Indigenous and people of color friends are going to do all of this work for us, because frankly, they're busy. They have things to do. And it can't just be the responsibility of the people of color to talk to us about what it is that we need to do to make early intervention in all systems more equitable. And so in the words of my very dear friend, Colette Telemaque-Collier, who does a lot of this work, she once said to me, like, sometimes you got to get your own people right. And so I think it's really important that those of us who've done a lot of this work in equity with white identities then help other folks who have similar identities really think critically about equity and race in the systems that we have an impact over. So I am really excited to be here. I was an early intervention provider for a little bit more than a decade, and now I am a professor of early childhood at Salem State University. Like I said, home of Hocus Pocus. So if any of you are ever here checking out Allison's house, come on over. I live right around the corner. So the first thing that I would like us to do before we even get into the objectives is I want you to take 2 minutes and sketch a photo, or not a photo, sketch a picture of what you think the typical family is. So I'm going to set a timer for about 90 seconds, 2 minutes, and have you just go ahead and draw that picture of a typical family. So I'm going to have you finish up your last couple of strokes. Again, it doesn't have to be a perfect photo, or it doesn't have to be a perfect drawing. This is just to get an idea of what you think of when you think of a typical family. So I want you to put that aside. We are going to come back to it, but we're not going to need it for a little bit. And now I'm going to share with you what our objectives for the day are. So today we're going to be we're going to develop an understanding of why we need to look inward as a crucial step for equitable early intervention provision. We're going to think about how our own cultural identities and beliefs develop. Where does that come from? Where do they, we're not just like born knowing exactly like what we think and believe and what we celebrate and how to behave, right? Those things are learned by everything around us. And we're going to talk about the mythical norm and how this idea of the mythical norm contributes to our implicit bias. So spoiler alert, this is actually why I had you draw a picture of a typical family before I gave you the objectives. We're going to come back to that and think about how our ideas of the mythical norm inform what we think about what a family is. So before we can really get into a lot of the pieces of identity, I think it's important to level set. And all of us have a clear foundation of what definitions that I'm working from as we're talking. So equity is really everyone getting what they need to thrive. So when we think about equity in early intervention, we would think about here's what everyone is getting the services that they need, right? All children, regardless of race or income or neighborhood or zip code, or whether they lived in Missouri or Kansas or Virginia or rural Virginia or more urban Virginia, like no matter where they live, any family who needed to access early intervention services would be able to get them and start them immediately. And they would all have a really positive experience where they felt their family capacity was improved, and they met those three outcomes, right? And so that's what equity would look like. So inequity is the unfair material distribution, or the unfair distribution of both material things, so like money, but also non-material things like access to early intervention or opportunities. And that results in predictable disparities by identity. So that means like when we talk about things like, I'm sure you've heard the achievement gap or the opportunity gap, where a lot of times children with Black and Brown identities don't do as well on standardized tests. Well, that's happening as early as early intervention. And so what we know is that Black and Latina children with developmental delays are 78% less likely to even have their need for EI identified. And then once they are identified, if they are identified, right, 78% of them are not getting the services they need. They are reporting, these Black and Latina families are reporting that they're not feeling listened to or valued. So we have that outcome disparity, which is what's the outcome? 78% of Black and Latino families who should be getting early intervention services for their children aren't getting them. And then that 12% of people who are getting services and should be getting them are reporting really unpleasant experiences with early intervention providers where they're feeling that they're not listened to and they're not valued, right? So that would be an experience disparity. So the experience is very different depending on who you are and what identity you're bringing in. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about inequity in early intervention, or just in general, right? So keep in mind those like outcome disparities. So they don't get the same opportunity. They don't have the same access to services, and then experience disparities, where even if they are in the system, they report much less productive and capacity building experiences, right? So when we're talking about that experiential equity piece, right, like how are families feeling as a part of the early intervention system? Experiential equity for families is when the families feel valued for their strengths and contributions. The families feel like their identities are respected and their ways of being and home culture and childrearing practices are respected. The families feel appreciated for their voice and they feel like their concerns are being heard and listened to. They feel really cared about by their early intervention team. They feel like they see themselves represented. So this can be tricky because we know that a lot of the early intervention providers and a lot of teachers in general across the United States tend to be white women, right? And that's not necessarily going to be representative of who we're serving in early intervention. And so they might be a Black family and all of the providers coming into their home are white, and they're giving us, right, we're not seeing representation. Or maybe they have providers that are recommending books or other things for the families, and everything that they're recommending is really centered on white children, and they're not seeing themselves reflected back in that way. Or they're not seeing themselves represented in the child rearing norms that the provider is sharing with the family, right? The other thing is that, like, when all these things happen, then families are feeling really comfortable and welcomed in the system, right? When families are experiencing an equitable experience in early intervention, they feel confident, but they're also feeling really challenged, right, to build capacity. We're not coddling anybody. We have really high expectations for what families are able to achieve, and the families feel challenged in a really positive way to build their skills. Families who are experiencing equity and early intervention really feel empowered to achieve their goals and make informed decisions for their children. And this can be, do I want to switch occupational therapists? Do I want to take a break over the summer? Do I feel good going into my transition? Being able to advocate for the setting that I think my child most needs, right? Do they feel empowered? And then they also are able to meet their family's needs, and they feel really again, they have the capacity and they feel empowered to do that. So that's what an experiential equity looks like in an early intervention setting. So I would like you to, now that we know what equity and inequity is looking at, I want you to think of a time that you experienced something inequitable. And I want you to take a minute and share in the chat how you felt during and after that situation. And it could very much be an outcome disparity, or it can be an experience disparity. Oh, so someone's sharing that they felt like really unwanted and rejected. Corey, you said you can't reach things because the world is not meant for people your size. And folks are feeling really uncomfortable. You're shutting down, you're feeling angry afterwards, right? And so those are all things that families in early intervention who are either not able to access service at all, right? So they're experiencing outcome disparities, or they're they have these experiential inequities, right? Where they're getting the experience, but it's a poor experience, and you're feeling really shut down and angry and rejected, right? So think about what that must feel like for all of these Black and Brown families in early intervention, right? That are getting these experiences that are inequitable, right? Yeah, someone's saying they were embarrassed and then mad about feeling embarrassed and then worried and wondering if, like, the attitudes, right? Wondering if the attitudes are going to lead to issues with career. And I think in an early intervention setting, we have, like, are these attitudes that people have about me going to impact the services that my child can get, or are they going to impact how people see my child, right? Someone just shared that their last name is Rodriguez, and there's a lot of stereotyping, and people automatically assume they speak Spanish, or that whatever that person's identity is, they have to speak Spanish, right? Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I want you to think about those feelings and how you felt when you experienced inequity when we talk about how families experience inequity, right? And I think that sets us up to talk a little bit about the layers of inequity, because inequity isn't just a provider going into your home and having some racist attitudes that they don't know about, or not being able to get a screening because families don't want to, or providers don't want to go into your neighborhood, right? Like that's not the only piece of inequity. Like inequity is really complex and layered. And so we're going to take some time and talk about what those layers of inequity are, right? So we have socio-historical inequity, and then there's ideological inequity, individual inequity, institutional inequity, cultural inequity, and structural inequity. And they each build on each other. And you can't really have the structural inequity without all of the pieces that come before it. So the first one that we're going to talk about is social historical identity, right? And this is the way that we're socialized to make sense of things like race and gender and sexuality. And so here's an example of that. In 1619, right, we started to make meaning about race in the United States, because that's when we started to have the ships of people who were going to be enslaved come to the United States. That's when the first slave ship got here. And in order to justify owning other people, there had to be this social agreement that one race was somehow better than another race, so that they could justify the owning of people, right? And this is deeply embedded in our American cultural beliefs, even though we don't allow that anymore and we're trying to move away from it. This is also really deeply embedded around like how we feel about gender and sexuality as a community. So if you think about women being the fairer sex, and women were supposed to be at home, and they weren't really seen as people who, especially in higher income households, they shouldn't be out working until we needed them to work during the 1950s. And then we were like, oh, I guess women can work, or 1940s during the war, women can work. And women are like seen as weaker or fairer or needing more protection. And these are all really deeply embedded attitudes that are so implicit in our own society that it's just like the truth, and we don't even think about it, and we're not examining it, and it's just a deep part of our shared identity as a society, right? So that next piece, the socio-historical view, right, of inequity, then goes into this ideological inequity. And these are when you have racist or sexist or ableist or homophobic worldviews and belief systems that have a deficit mindset about how this other group can't or won't, what they can and can't do, and how we interpret everything we know about the group, right? So this is that, like, the socio-historical belief, and some of the studies that were done around like trying to say that Black and brown people were somehow biologically inferior to white folks, or that like women just aren't as strong, things like that. We then that becomes deeply embedded in our own psyches, and it becomes our guiding ideology, whether we want it to or not. And we start to think of other groups that are different from the white male identity as somehow like less. And we come up with like a gender or race or ability hierarchy, right? Even in the way we talk about abilities, right? We talk about kids with disabilities. And so we're defining people by what they aren't or what they can't do, right? So that's really a deficit mindset. So once that happens, you then have your ideological racism and sexism and ableism informs how we interact with other people. And this is what happens when one person says or does something racist against one other person, right? And it can be really small, like when you're talking to a Latina person and you're like, wow, your English is so good, right? When what you're thinking in your brain is like, obviously Spanish must be their first language, and that might not be true. English could be their first language. They could be fully bicultural and biliterate and bilingual, or maybe they're multilingual. And that is that racist action. And that's a small thing. It's called a microaggression, but there are often much larger racist actions, like when we have the folks in Central Park who are like, wow, there's a Black man. Excuse me, I'm sorry, it's that time of year when I get a little dry cough. when you have the woman who's calling the police because there's a Black man bird watching, and she's like, there's a Black man in the park, he must be dangerous, because of her her ideologies about Black men, that ends up coming out in an individual interaction. And then the cumulative impact of institutional racism, or the cumulative impact of racist and sexist and ableist policies, is institutional racism. And that's what happens when all these racist ideologies are in people that are hired, and we keep hiring individuals in the institution. I am so sorry, y'all. And what ends up happening is we are now having a lot of challenges with one particular institution that has all of these racist policies, right? So here's an example of that. When ideological racism is embedded into policies, that's when we have like racist screening tools, or when we're hiring people for our early intervention practice who don't want to go into Black neighborhoods or don't want to work with interpreters, then it becomes really institutionalized. And then we have the cultural inequity, which is this constant societal messages that says that like white heteronormative patriarchal supremacy is the best thing. And we hear a ton about it from media and school curriculum and children's books, and just that like white male heterosexual abled people are better in some ways. And if you think back to like all of the children's books we read, like the Dick and Jane books, or even a lot of the children's books we're reading, and for those of us that work in disability services, just how hard it is to find a really good book that features children with autism, that's not just about autism, right? Or that features a child in a wheelchair, just like, or who's a wheelchair user, just like living their everyday life, and thinking about how that broadcast media and the school curriculum is feeding into like, this is the best way. So examples about that are, for a really long time when I started early intervention, there was this cultural messaging that English was superior. And if children were going to have a disability and be bilingual, that we should actually only teach them English because it was more important than their home language, right? This idea of like English is the goal, as opposed to the home language and communicating with the family. And then we get this structural inequity, which is this full network and all of the implications of all of these other pieces that become really firmly built into our structures in society. So it's things like the educational system, criminal justice, the employment systems. So think a lot about how so many of our schools, even though we have full inclusion programs, really want, or they don't want, but they're like, well, we're going to put all of the kids with disabilities in this one classroom because we only have, they all need speech minutes, but we only have one speech therapist. We don't have the money. And so we're going to put them all in this one classroom. And because there's a child who's a wheelchair user in that classroom, it has to be like on the first floor in kind of a basement setting. And then you have all of those structural pieces built into what's going on in the school that creates these really inequitable outcomes for those kids. So I know that that was a huge amount of information. It's all in the handout. And it's been adapted from Paul Gorski and Marceline Dubose and Seema Pathini's Equity Literacy Institute. If you want to dig further into it, I highly recommend that you do. But again, we also have it on your handout for further reference. So knowing all of that, right? All of those giant pieces of all of the different layers of inequity. Why are we asking you to look inward, right? If I've just told you that there are all these layers of inequity, why are we asking you to look inward? Well, the reason is we have to really understand who we are and how those messages and how those layers of racism become embedded in us, because we're not just individuals, we're actually part of a system, right? So we're actually at the institutional and structural level of the layers of inequity as early intervention providers, or as system managers or coordinators or service coordinators. We are, in fact, beyond just the individual level, right? The decisions that we make become institutional. So a lot of us think like, well, I'm a really nice person. I don't have those biases. Well, that's just simply not true, because we've all been raised in a deeply inequitable, biased society. And so if you're thinking about American culture as a sink of dishwater, right? And the American culture is the water, and you just want to suck up the water and the good stuff, right? But if we're sponges, and that is soapy dishwater, and the soap in that dishwater represents the inequity, the racism and the sexism and the ableism in our society, it's impossible to take in just the water and not the soap. Just like it's impossible to take in the really good parts of our culture, and there are a lot of really great things about American culture, right? Without taking in also the structural or the layers of inequity and the implicit biases and the ideological and socio-historical racism that comes with American society. And so I really love this picture of the sponge, because it reminds me, like, I want to only take in the good things about our culture and our society, but I have to take in all of it, because you can't separate the soap from the water at this point. And we have to be really clear about what that means for ourselves, right? We don't get to choose what we take in. And so we have to be really thoughtful about how we've taken in those messages and internalized them, both about our own identities and the identities of other people, right? So while we're looking inward, we have to start with our own identities. So I would like you to please tell us in the chat, what are your primary identities? Like when someone says, who are you? Share in the chat how you would describe yourself. We have a mother, you're a kind person, you're determined. We have another person who sees themselves as a mom, as a helper. Oh, Diana is a white married lady from the Midwest. Corey is a mom. Babka, she's Slovak. We have more moms, nurses, wives, daughters, friends, wife, sister, aunt, right? A lot of us, you're an instructor, a mom, a friend. A lot of us are really looking at our identities as like the ones that we choose, some of the roles we choose for ourselves, right? I am a mother, I am a professor, I'm an educator, I'm a friend, right? So here are some of my identities. I'm a wife, I'm a mom, I'm a professor, I'm a friend, I am an exceedingly intermediate, right? Horsewoman, and or solidly intermediate horsewoman. And I think of myself, the identities I think of about myself are all things that I choose. But it's interesting to me that most of us didn't actually write about how our primary, some of our primary identities are actually our racial identities, right? Most of us didn't say, like, I'm white. And for those of us with white racial identities, a lot of that is because that's not how other people see us first, right? They see us as like a mother or a friend or a professor or an early intervention provider. Whereas for most people of color, Black, Latino, Latina, Indigenous, Asian, South Asian, Middle Eastern, folks in the United States see them and reflect back to them their racial identity first before they see any of those other identities, right? And so one of the interesting things that happens for those of us with white identities is that it takes us a little bit longer to really think about what that means. And that's part of this work. We have to really understand what our white racial identity means for us before we can really look outward and understand how that's impacting the way that we're engaging with families and what our behavior is. Because if you remember back to the sponge, we have taken in all of the really good stuff about our white identities and about our white American identity. And then also, we've taken in the parts that we didn't necessarily want to take in, like the sexism and the racism and the ableism. Lisa shared in the chat that she often, instead of just being like accepted for showing up as who she is, she's always asked like, what are you? Because she is a person with an Asian American identity, right? And instead of just allowing, they need to categorize Lisa, right? In a way that like no one has ever asked me with my blue eyes and generally blonde hair, what I am. I've never had that question asked ever, right? And so this builds into what I'm going to talk to you about, which is the mythical norm, right? This mythical norm is really like, it really comes from the soapy part of our American culture, right? The soapy, like racist, sexist, ableist part. It's this idea that there's a normal thing, like there's this mythical norm that like everybody's like this, and then it's only different or diverse when it's different. And just like I can't make my horse a unicorn by putting this fake unicorn horn on his head, we can't actually make a family into the mythical norm. So I know this is Gus's unicorn horn. Corey and I really love it. As you can see, my horse Gus does not love it. And frankly, the reason we love this picture is because we can't turn a family into the mythical norm any more than I can turn this horse into a unicorn. And I would imagine that the families like trying to be turned into something else, even less than Gus likes this unicorn horn, right? And so I want you to think back to your family. I want you to think back to your drawing of the typical family, right? And I want you to think about what you drew and how they might be the mythical norm, right? So in your drawing, who did you have in your drawing? What was your family? I'm wondering if a lot of you drew like a mom, a dad, 2 kids, maybe a dog. Oh, someone drew their own family, right? A stick people, you, your husband, 3 kids, 2 dogs. And yes, Tracy, I will absolutely share this picture of Gus with you. A mom, a dad, a son, a daughter, a cat, right? All the bodies in the same. So we're drawing these like really like heteronormative, nuclear families, right? We're not drawing husband, daughter. We're not necessarily drawing these like big extended families or families with a child with a notable disability or single parent families or same-sex couple families, because again, we have developed this idea of like, here's what a typical normal family is. So where does that come from, right? Where does it come from that we have developed these mythical norms in our heads, even though the families that we see in early intervention and even our own families, right, don't necessarily conform to this mythical norm? So like, where does that come from? And the answer is, it's like part of our socio-historical and ideological thoughts, right? So here's where it comes from. It's the soapy part of the water, and it just seeps in. So here's where it comes from. You might remember from your schooling this great Bronfenbrenner model, the ecological systems model of human development, right? And there's the microsystem and the mesosystem and the exosystem and the macrosystem, and like and then the chronosystem, and the baby is in the middle. So today, we're actually going to think about ourselves being in the middle and all of the influences around us that help us get all of those ideological beliefs sort of deeply embedded in our psyches without us even realizing it, right? So the first part is this microsystem, right? These are the people closest to us that we interact with the most. This can be your religious leaders, your neighbors, your friends. This is people that you love and really like, right? Your spouses, your best friends. It can also be people that I joke that like you might hate with the fire of 1,000 suns, but you have to work with every day or share an office with. Your early intervention families are in your microsystem because you see them all of the time, your bosses, your friends. And these are the people that often have the most impact over our thinking, right? So in your own microsystem, so your family, your friends, your religious leaders, your teachers, your professors, what messages did you get from them about the right way to care for babies, right? What are some of the right ways that we care for babies? We don't share beds, right? That's babies sleep in a crib or a bassinet. We keep babies clean. We give them baths all the time. Oh, breastfeeding, right? Babies sleep on their back. Nurturing means to be really gentle, right? We've gotten all these messages. And I remember when I was a new mom, so many like strangers would tell me how to raise my baby, right? But also like the messages that were the most important, the ones that I saw myself doing, were the ones that I learned sometimes implicitly, not even by people saying anything, by the people around me, my family, my friends. Right. And here's an example of that. I come from a baby wearing family. We don't really use strollers. We wear our babies. And I don't remember anyone ever saying to me, Megan, when you have your baby, you should wear her in a sling. But I 100% remember all of the caregivers around me. When I was growing up, there was just a lot of baby wearing. And at my baby shower, people gave me different kinds of baby wearing contraptions. And so there was a lot of like implicit messaging about like, this is how we carry babies, right? And so you get a lot of these ideas, both when people make really rude comments to you about like, well, I hope you're going to breastfeed that baby. Or if you're someone who does extended breastfeeding, well, how long are you going to breastfeed that baby? But also by the ways we see other people behaving and interacting with those babies, right? So the messages are both explicit, something someone says to you, but also they're really powerful in their implicit, when they're implicit, and they're just what we're seeing modeled to us without anyone talking about it, right? So this next factor, we're going to skip the mesosystem for this example, and we're going to go into the exosystem, right? And these are the factors that we interact with all of the time, but we actually have little control over them. So this is things like your curriculum, screening and assessment tools, the curriculum at the local school district. This is a ton of what we see on social media, what we see in books, what we're seeing on TV, in TikTok videos, right? These are messages that we get from the outside, but that we ourselves, like I'm not really interacting in a two-way reciprocal relationship with the book that I'm reading, but it is in fact telling me a lot about what society says, right? So like one of my favorite books to read my daughter was The Paper Bag Princess, which is telling us a lot about how like a princess can save a prince. And so she's getting, when I was reading that to her, she was getting a lot of implicit messaging about girls, but she wasn't really like able to influence that messaging back. So something that happens, we know that less than 15% of all children's books actually have characters of color as the main character, right? So we're seeing like this lack of representation, and families are not seeing themselves in books, right? And that tells us, or when we're reading books, we always see like, do you remember those Richard Scarry books from when we were little, like The Busy Town? It was always like the mama animals, the female animals caring for the baby, and like the father animals were out somewhere. And that's telling us, that's like implicitly telling us like, this is your role, depending on your gender. So I want you to think back about your identities, right? And actually, I want you to think more about your race and gender identity here. Where did you see messages about your own identity? Oh, and I just found a typo because of course I did. Where did you see messages about your own identity when you were growing up and forming that identity? What are some of the places in the exosystem or that you saw those? You can give specific examples like certain books you read or certain shows you watched. What are some of those messages that you got growing up about race and gender and how they related to you? A lot of books and cartoons, right? Oh, Janine says like she didn't see anyone who wasn't really just like her in the books and cartoons. And if it was pointed out, right? Like I remember growing up, the only show that I ever watched that had Black characters, which has aged very poorly now, was The Cosby Show or A Different World. And like everything else was a really big deal. Or even I used to read a lot. I still read a lot. And like the Babysitter's Club, I remember. I read a lot about that. Everything I read. So that was like Caregiving Girls, right? I didn't have a lot of access to things like The Paper Bag Princess, right? Where the women are saving the men, right? It was a lot of like, let's fall in love and have babies, and this is how it is. And a lot of like, so a lot of people are saying like books and TV, right, are forming our opinions. That's also actually where you get messages about other people's races and genders, especially in terms of like media coverage, right? So when I was growing up, one of the things we heard a lot about, and this goes into the like socio-historical and ideological piece, was the crack epidemic and crack babies, and how this was a problem with like the breakdown of the Black family, right? Which wasn't actually true, but the media coverage was pretty intense around it. And so that's what we interpret, right? And in fact, one of the things that we do know is that some of these messages get so internalized that there was a recent study that came out about early interventionists and who they target for their intervention. And they said they didn't target Black dads because they weren't around anyway, when time use studies actually show that Black fathers are more engaged in the daily caregiving of their children than white upper middle class and middle class dads, right? But think about like all those messages we're getting from the news and from books and magazines about the breakdown of the Black family or the crack epidemic or all of these things that we were getting that are so deeply embedded, right? It's that soapy part of our sponge, so deeply embedded that we don't even realize we have those thoughts and that they're actually wrong. So this last part, well, not the last part, the second to the last part is the macro system, right? Which is this larger context. And this is things like the federal government, the economy, and federal programs, which is, right? Part C, early intervention is a federal program. So interestingly, from the very beginning, macro level policy established who's white, and it actually has changed through the years. And what groups are invited to immigrate into the United States and who can live in what neighborhoods in town. So there was something called redlining, and because of redlining, people couldn't get loans. And this is actually redlining today. We don't have redlining anymore officially, but it's actually why some of our neighborhoods are so incredibly segregated. It all goes back to federal policy about giving loans for new homes. It also, federal policy didn't always allow Black soldiers to get the GI Bill or allow, and they allowed federal policy allowed the segregation of schools, but it also was very particular about who could and could not immigrate into the United States. And again, the people around us influence our thinking, right? And so if we're only around other people who are exactly like us, then we don't have the same interactions, and we're depending on the exosystem and the macro system and all these other influences. And that's where we get the like implicit bias and the soapy sponge. So the last part is this chrono system, which is like, where are we at this moment in time? And what do we know? But also like, where are you in your developmental timeline? So an example of this would be when I was a kid, there was not any access for me around seeing other people with disabilities, right? Because I was a kid in the 80s and all of the kids with disabilities were either at a totally different school or they were like in a basement classroom. And so I didn't really have any experience with people with disabilities. And so when I got to, because that was what we did at the time, right? There was not a lot of interaction and inclusion around children with disabilities. So when I got to college and I wanted to be a teacher, I had a teacher say to me, I really think you should be a special ed teacher. And I was like, oh no, like, why would I want to work with those kids, right? And I'm ashamed of that now. But again, it had so much to do with like the socio-historical time of when I went to school. And I now have a daughter who's about to turn 13, and she's been in inclusive spaces and has a cousin with autism. And so she does not have those like initial reactions about disability that I had. And for her, she looks at people with autism as just people with autism, and she is able to interact, and they don't seem mysterious or scary or different or weird like they may have when I was young. So this generation, and what we know now, and we're starting to shift how we think about people with disabilities, is just, it's shifting the attitudes of the kids who are coming up after us, right? It's also like our current and shared funds of knowledge and scientific discovery. So do you remember I told you like way back 100 years ago, they were using 150, 200 years ago, they were using some studies to try and show that like white folks were actually somehow biologically superior. Well, we now actually know that's not true. We have like human genome sequencing, and there's actually like no genetic markers for race. There's genetic markers for skin tone, but like there's no actual genetic markers for race. And so we are now understanding more about what's going on than we did before, right? You know what, Joe Sherlin, I really love that these generations have embraced this shift as well. And this is sort of where it comes in with like the developmental timeline in somebody's life, right? Like I'm getting all of this information as an adult. And so I have to like relearn and reteach and like reshape my brain. And then I have these implicitly biased thoughts and I have to address them. Whereas I think a lot of our kids are getting them earlier on. And so they're not as firmly set. They don't have as many implicit biases as firmly set as perhaps you and I have, or those of us in my generation, right? So again, I want you to revisit this family sketch and think about like, what does your mythical norm family look like? Who's in the family? What we didn't talk about earlier is like, what race do you think the family was that you drew? Did you think about it? And if you didn't think about it, what is the default race in your brain? And what language do you think the family spoke that you drew? Where do you think they live? These are all things that all of those factors that we just talked about lead to. And this mythical norm is in our ideologies. And it gets into, again, we are not just ideologically and individually racist or sexist or homophobic when we have these thoughts. We're part of this bigger system. So we're actually part of the institution. And in some cases, we're part of the structure, right? Depending on what our jobs are. And so it's really important to think about where those ideas come from. And again, it's not bad that you have those ideas. It's just that we have to be really aware of them. So the other reason that this is really important is because our main job in early intervention is to build capacity to meet family needs. And so one of the things that we think about, if we think that there's one right way, right, to raise babies, then we're going to try and whiten families or try and make them more like us as we coach them to build their capacity. So here's an example of that. This is actually from my actual career. I worked with a family, this Korean American family in downtown Chicago, And the family was wealthier. Both the parents worked some pretty fancy, high-powered jobs. They lived in a big high-rise downtown. And I started doing a co-treat with them. So we got a brand new OT, and the family had asked that they really wanted us to come as late in the day as possible. So the occupational therapist and I got there at 5, and the baby was just waking up from a nap. And the OT was like, "Oh, wow, that's really late for a nap. Like, aren't you worried he's not going to go to bed tonight?" And the family's like, "Oh, no, we keep him up with us. Like, he goes to bed with us around 10." And she was like, "Well, wait, like, can you tell me about your bedtime routine?" And the family's like, "Oh yeah, like he gets up around 5:30 or 5:30 from his nap, and we have dinner, and then we spend time together. And then he sleeps with us, and we snuggle him and he falls asleep. And then he's still sleeping when we get up in the morning and go to work." And the OT immediately said to the family, "Oh, well, we need to get him in his own bed and self-soothing to fall asleep right away." Right? So here's an example around how her own cultural beliefs impacted that interaction. So what are some of your cultural beliefs about where children should sleep and when children should go to bed, right? Do you have like set thoughts about like the right place for children to sleep and the right kind of sleep schedule? Can you share those in the chat? Corey says she's used to babies sleeping in their own room. And then someone shared that they co-sleep even with their elementary school age daughter, and it super freaks people out, right? Because we have this idea about where children should sleep. And so they should be in their own beds, they should be self-soothing. And actually, most of the world outside of the United States and some of the white European countries like Great Britain and Ireland, most of the world soothes their babies until they're quite old and sleeps with them, right? So here's one of those examples of how this provider's cultural beliefs created this huge experiential inequity for this family in early intervention, right? They were in early intervention because the son needed help learning how to talk and had some sensory stuff, but this OT was really focused on like the right way that their child should be sleeping and when he should be sleeping, as opposed to like what is important for the family and how do we work around the family's schedule, right? I love how Lindsay admits like it's really shocking when kids go to bed so late, right? So this particular family, the parents worked really late. They had these fancy high-powered jobs, and so they really wanted their son to be awake and up with them, and he didn't go to school. They had a nanny. So they would spend time with him. He would go to bed at 10. They would get up at 6 or 7 in the morning. He would sleep in till 8 or 9. And so they would get up and have breakfast together and have like their own couple time, sometimes go to the gym and go off to work. And that's why that schedule really worked for them. But I know it's not just Lindsay, where a lot of us are like, those babies should be in bed at 7 p.m. Right? And again, that's a really an American cultural belief. So this is just an example of how our racial and cultural identities really, really deeply impact how we're interacting with other people and how we're coaching families and how we're trying to build their capacity and what capacity we're building them toward. Which is why we really need to have a deeper understanding of who we are and our identities so that we can see our own biases before they shape our actions, right? Like ideally we want that OT who was a really nice person and didn't realize that she had these biases. We want her to be able to like have that thought in her brain and be like, nope, that's a biased thought. I'm just going to roll with it instead of actually having it shape her interaction with that family. So you are obviously not going to solve all of these problems around equity in one session with me, right? Although I'm so glad you're here. So the next steps for you are real critical reflection about your own identity. And this can be done in a variety of ways. There's another session coming up in November for Talks on Tuesday. This happens in communities of practice, either formal communities of practice or informal communities of practice. Corey can tell you a little bit more about what are some of the things we have cooking up at VEIPD, but here are some of my favorite resources. I really encourage you, if you are a person with a white identity, to start with Waking Up White by Debbie Irving. She has this amazing chapter that actually breaks down what white American culture is. That was so helpful for me because, you know, we can't tell you what the water is when we're floating around in it as a sponge, because it's the only thing we know. And so sometimes it's really nice to have it pointed out for you. I also really like this Do the Work Anti-Racist Activity book by Kamau Bell and Kate Schatz. And then once you're ready for like this varsity level, I call it varsity level, interactions or critical reflection on your own, there's this amazing book and workbook called Me and White Supremacy by Layla Said, and she also has a podcast. I highly recommend those things. And if you are looking for a specific piece, you can also get in touch with me as well. And hopefully you'll be back for part 2 of this webinar series. And so Corey's going to come in and tell us how you can register for those things.
So I want to thank Megan for getting us started on this topic. As she said, we are so well aware that this is an introduction to this topic. And part 2, we are going to be joined by Barbara Grant and Leah Davison, who are both former Virginia early interventionists. Barbara's now in Texas. Leah is in New Mexico. And as a little sneak peek, after we finish these talks on Tuesday, the plan is after the new year to start an echo that we can have people more intimately explore this topic. So stay tuned. Those of you who joined for our session will have the opportunity to register first. So kind of a little bonus for being able to join us for Talks on Tuesday. So if you registered for today's Talks on Tuesday, and obviously you did because you're here, you are automatically registered for the November 1st session. So there's no action that you need to do on your part. We can go to the next slide, please. As a reminder, you all probably know this, but by the back of your hand, but you should have a survey about our Talks on Tuesday today already in your inbox. Take that survey, and as soon as you do that, you will get a certificate. So you can have professional development content for this. So I want to thank everybody for joining us. Megan, thank you for sharing your expertise. Virginia is going to be working with Megan and Leah and Barbara in the future. So you all will be getting to hear more from Megan in the future. So I see that we are at 1 o'clock. If you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and type those in chat, and we will try to address those. At least individually, we'll reach out to you. So thank you all and have a good afternoon.